Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WookieCast. Today we're sitting down with Zoraida Córdova, and she has written several Star Wars novels in recent years. Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to get into what your earliest Star Wars memory is.
My earliest Star Wars memory is a little complicated because I feel like Star Wars is one of those things that for a lot of us, it's always been there. And so I have a few, I have like me and my brother in our studio apartment, after school, watching the movies, play acting the scenes. He was always Luke Skywalker, and then I was always Jabba the Hutt because, of course, I'm the big sister and he's the little annoying brother. Um, and so I think that it's mostly familial. And when I was a kid, one of my mom's coworkers gave her a box of Star Wars toys. And so I just remember having the toys almost before we watched the movies. But I knew who they were just because, again, Star Wars is in the zeitgeist.
Um, if you could write about any Star Wars character in the future, who do you think that would be? Someone that you haven't written about before, perhaps.
Um, Oh, that's kind of hard. I would love to write Din obviously in The Mandalorian or um uh Cassian Andor. I also would love to write like Rey after the Rise of Skywalker. But there's so much Star Wars to do. I mean, and I have this character Churro the Hutt from the middle grades, which I wrote. I know that I have already written him, but I think I would continue to want to write about him.
That kind of leads into the next topic, where the Nameless is your latest Star Wars release. And timeline-wise, it was kind of set within a lot of different things because there's a lot of things going on in the universe at that time. Was there any collaboration with other authors, such as like I know George Mann's Tears of the Nameless was really close to that.
When we have these stories going on, we have two calls every month with the whole group where we all try to be there, and we have a Slack group where everybody's always like asking each other questions like, are you using this character, are you doing that? And so in that sense, yeah, but I think that we all turn in individual outlines of what we want to do and how we want to move these characters through the story, and then after that, that's when we make sure all of those threads are tied, and none of them are like snagged or anything like that.
Making sure two characters aren't in the same book at the same
Yeah,
time,
it's
different books
not
at the same
all
time.
canon, but there's a lot of people that go into that, like story group, the High Republic part of story group, and uh Lucasfilm and Disney and everybody. So it's everything gets looked at.
Because two of the characters, Tep Tep and Kildo, were from Escape from Valor originally, so it was like expanding on that kind of.
Mhm. Yeah, and so Beware the Nameless picks up where a little bit after Daniel's novel, somehow they managed to get off of Valo, and that was, the escape from Valo aspect of the middle grade, and Daniel and Alyssa created these wonderful characters on this planet. And so for me, I felt like I needed to take the kids to the next level because they're still children, even though they're Jedi children, and they're living through this war period on this occupied planet that's occupied by the Nile. And so my question is like, what does it look like to have hope when uh everything is going wrong, and you're facing an unbeatable obstacle, and you're still really, really young, and the galaxy is so big. And so I felt like I was trying to grapple with a lot of those different themes that Daniel and Alyssa laid the groundwork for. Ram is obviously aging out, he's growing up and becoming more of like a mentor type of person because he's had to become a leader. So we see a little bit of his change, but this is really the story of the younger set of younglings. And a surprising Hut new bestie. Uh, and then the daughter of a senator at
In the
yeah.
Greylark bloodline, so to say.
Yes, yes. Left that part out.
Um, it's kind of interesting to see though, because obviously they couldn't just intentionally put them on that mission. So the fact that they kind of snuck onto it is kind of reminiscent of Anakin, kind of be like, well, not really supposed to be on Naboo, but you're
Yeah.
here.
That's some of my favorite Star Wars tropes are surprise stowaways, younger people getting into shenanigans and hijinks. And I think that spirit lives on from the original trilogy to now.
One of the characters we see featured is Ada Lee Caro. She hasn't featured in much other media before, even though she's existed kind of on the outskirts. How did you go about fleshing out her character?
Well, for Italy Caro, who plays a very important part in Beware the Nameless. It was mostly making sure that we had a Master Jedi or an Elder Jedi with the younglings during this mission. And so thinking about who she is on the council, who she is as a Jedi, and what she believes in, and what she feels the Jedi are able to do or not do when it comes to fighting back against denial and these creatures, the nameless, that they're all facing. And so I had to think a little bit about her, but ultimately, because this is a middle grade, um, I also needed to focus on the kids and how they are going to take matters into their own hands. Usually for children's and young adult novels, which I've been writing since the start of my career in 2012, there's always the challenge of how do I return the story, the core of the story, the plot to the young kids who are the stars of it and the centers of it.
It must be kind of difficult because these are really deep topics, but the target audience is very young. So there's grief, there's loss, but they're just children, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that children are incredibly strong. I think that children see the world differently, obviously, because there's so much inexperience, but there's so much there's the ability to learn and to be very, very observant. And I think that there are kids who are going through grief. Like how many kids are living in combat zones or in places that have a lot of political tension. I think that it would be inhuman to ignore that there are a lot of kids in really hard situations. Even if it's not a war, it could be a home life or something like that, or something happening at school. And so these feelings are extrapolated and magnified in the situations happening in the book, right? Like your life is falling apart uh, in real life school, and in this book, this kids, their galaxy, their planet, their everyday life is being torn apart by a monster, right? And so this monster is something that we can beat, and it gives you a little bit of hope in your real life. And that's ultimately what I hope for.
That's kind of something with Churro as well. He wasn't necessarily part of the Nihil conflict until now, but he had a difficult home life. What was kind of it like developing him as a new character who hadn't been introduced in anything before?
Yeah, so with Churro the Hutt, I really wasn't sure I was going to be able to get away with it. I was like, guys, like my email to when I pitched this project, I was like, hey, like hear me out, literally, hear me out. What about this kind of hut that we've never seen before? I think it really works in the middle grade space, because I think all of us have felt outsiders at one point or another, like everyone, even like the popular person, or like if we're thinking about this in the children's space, and in real life, like adulthood, people don't stop being bullies, which is because they stop being teenagers, unfortunately. And so I think that with Churro, it was sort of like thinking about every insecurity you might have, um and anxiety, and turning them into like a little a little wimpy hut who has to find his courage.
And it's kind of interesting because you can tell that his sister cares, but she's going to be with the rest of his family and he's going to go his own way, but she still cares about him, which is nice to see.
Yeah,
Um, there's also some other characters that have just various things. I was curious if there's any effort to work in kind of like planets from your others, because I noticed Actlion, I think is how you pronounce it, and Aerodac got mentioned um, in Hayes and Jamila's backstories, respectively. I was curious if that was intentional.
that was intentional. I, you know, sometimes you create these planets and you never know if you're going to be able to return to them. And actually, Eridak, the planet that Izzy Garcia uh it went to college from, and the planet that Jamil Solis is from, the newest youngling in the group. That planet is going to be featured in the annual one shot that I wrote about Churro the Hutt.
That's really
Um,
exciting.
so yeah, so we get to see it, like, and I remember saying that when we were editing, because the comic, because I was like, oh, well, I actually have never seen this planet because I made it up for a Crash of Fate. And I didn't think that I would like visually be able to think about it. I mean, I did think about it when I created it. But it's just it's really cool to be able to see it in the comic and in Beware the Nameless.
That is one thing about, I guess, novels. You don't get a lot of visual depictions of a lot of the characters. So unless they're on the cover, you don't really get to see what they look like.
Yeah, and we
Um,
can describe it, but I think that everyone receives that information a little bit differently.
I think it's funny because you can know so much about a character and not know their species. I know for Anatola in A Crash of Fate, a couple of us read the book. We're like, "There's no species here. We tried." Um, all right. Let's see. Convergence was another lovely work of yours. I was curious what was it like writing for that era of the High Republic because that was obviously much further before the Nile, although I'm assuming that you probably had read most of the Phase 1 books. What was
Yeah.
that like? Because that was kind of like the flagship, the starting book of that
Yes,
phase.
that phase. Honestly, for it feels a little bit like a whirlwind, because it happened so quickly. You know, one day I'm getting this message like, "Did you check your email?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't checked my email," and it's an invitation to join the initiative of the High Republic, and that was really cool because I had been watching it from afar and I'd been starting to read the books as they were coming out. And so that was my first homework, was to catch up on the stuff that was available, which is it's sort of like when I worked on A Crash of Fate, where I got this like 180-page document from the theme parks that showed the entire theme park and the world building inside of it. And so being able to have that and to go through it, I try to figure out who my character was. I basically like was given a scenario, and then I turned in I created the story to the scenario. And that's, yeah, that's where I wound up with like we're two planets at war. And I knew what the planets were, but there wasn't a lot about them yet. I just knew one was a deserty planet, one was a watery planet. And so and then I built on top of that.
I found it really fun how there was two sets of queens from two different eras. It's like, well, the first time we see it, there's two queens, and then there's more two queens. It's amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
I was like, well, there could have been two queens 100 years ago again. Uh, I just really wanted a queen, so we're like, here we go.
Um, was romance always at the heart of that story? Because I thought that was a really interesting twist. I know that there is a romance in a lot of Star Wars books, but I thought that was really unique. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I am a romance writer. I, you know, I try to fight against that instinct uh very early on in my career, and even when I was a young person writing in college or in workshops and things like that. I was always like I loved romance, and my teachers were like, "Oh, well, this is too, romancy." And I'm like, I guess that's the point. Or in the beginning of young adult novels, they're like, well, you don't have to add a romance to everything. And so I always fought against that instinct. And then when I like turned 30, I was like, well, I'm gonna write what I want to write. And that's it. And I don't care anymore. If one person doesn't like romance, I think that the majority of people love love. Star Wars is a love story, and it's a love story. And if it wasn't for this one great love story, none of it would have happened, right? And so Star Wars needs that love. And when you think about it, if you have two planets fighting, what is the thing that's going to bring them together, right? What's going to unite them and what has united kingdoms in our history? So it just really made sense to me from a story perspective, and also uh, just me as a fan of Anakin and Padme and Han and Leia, and thinking about the different kinds of love that we see in the Star Wars universe.
I thought it was really interesting to see how it's like the younger generation who they love their planet so much, and the older generation just doesn't understand that you can love your planet and not hate the other side, which is really interesting. Um, but there's also other types of love in the book, such as Axel's mother, obviously giving up a lot for him. Um, what was it kind of like delving into his backstory? Because you wrote a short story on this, on Axel. What was
Yeah,
that like, delving into a bit of his backstory? We learned his father's name for one thing, I remember.
yeah. So writing Axel as a like in college, or high school. I mean Star Wars University
Academy, something.
Academy. When he's in school, and he's young, writing that was really I had made let me backtrack. I had made a few notes to myself of like who he might have been as somebody in school. And I remember thinking like, okay, he's a troublemaker. He's like the kid that would befriend the janitor because like sometimes he doesn't fit in with his classmates or things like that. And so because I come from young adult, that's what I asked all of these questions about his inner life, and who he might have been before the path of the open hand got their hands on him, on his weakness. And we get to see his father, whom he has like, a really loving relationship with. And so that was really fun for me to write as well.
You mentioned that he was quite manipulative. Was that kind of what the character of Binno did, where he was like kind of his friend, but kind of manipulating him? There's an interesting amount of tension there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's calculating, and he knows how to move a room, right? Like he knows how to move people, and it's like he's playing chess with the people that are in the room. Um and so you see like the inklings of what he's going to be later on.
It's interesting. Um, and one other thing to circle back on something you mentioned earlier was, sorry to shift books on you, but you mentioned for A Crash of Fate you received a lot of documents on what the park looked like. Was the park wasn't in operation by the time you were starting to write, right? So you couldn't go visit it in person.
Mhm.
Um, what was
So
it like kind of writing about locations that wouldn't yet exist but would exist?
well, the artwork was incredibly detailed, and when we went, so a group of us, Delilah Dawson, Will Sliney, and Ethan Sachs, and myself, we went with some of the Lucasfilm people and Disney folks, and we went to the opening in Florida. Nothing like Florida in August. But it was wonderful. And sometimes I'm like, wow, has it really only been 5 years? But anyway, so when we went, I was like, oh my God, every little detail is on like the lichen on the surfaces, the Oga's Cantina, um, the workshop, and all of these other places. Like it was just so cool to see and how accurate it had been. And I was like, thank God it's accurate because, I try to put as much detail into it as possible.
Yep, I did notice I've written a lot of like the drinks from that novel and just some of the characters. I was curious what kind of played into writing Azal Garcia because she's obviously a very conflicted character, very young, and there's a bit of romance too, but it doesn't really kick in until the end of the book, so that's not the main point. What was that like?
Yeah, well, for Izzy Garci, writing her romance is sort of like if we're talking about tropes, because I'm a romance writer, uh she's uh she's the grumpy sunshine, right? I really like that dynamic where one person in the couple is a little bit happier, or uh literally sunshine, and the other person's a little grumpy. And so I really like writing that dynamic. I thought it would be interesting. Wow, I haven't thought about this book in such a long time. Thank you for reminding me. Uh and then we have with Jules, he's somebody who reminded me so much of Luke Skywalker, where he wanted to leave his planet, but he was scared. Luke actually did leave his planet, but he was forced to leave his planet. And so what would have happened if he hadn't been, right? If he had gotten comfortable? And I think that's what happened to Jules. And so Izzy's sort of this person that he has in his memory. And so we sort of like turn people in our past into icons if we had a good experience, right? And so she was always like the girl that he was in love with, but she left, um, and never came back, and comes back out of nowhere, and literally crashes into his life again. And it's a 24 hours. I think I pitched it when I pitched it to Lucasfilm. I was like, do you remember that movie Before Sunset? Can I just do like a one day romance, where they're just like trying to steal back like stolen briefcase, not a briefcase, but you know what I mean. Like that. And so that was really fun to pitch, but romance is just, it felt like an integral part of it, and that relationship is something that I really miss writing
Is that
those
kind of a
two.
play on the title then? A crash of fate, them crashing into each other's lives again?
Yeah, I think so. I would think so. I think that's where we ended up. We had tried dozens of titles, and this is where we landed. I can't remember. I would have to look into a million emails to try to find that again.
Um, it's really interesting because as a Star Wars author, you have the ability to kind of, I don't know if you're a fan of any of the Star Wars Legends content that used to come out. Do you ever try to work elements of that into your novels alongside creating new things? Be like, oh, that random species, I'm gonna pull that over here.
You know, I do have like a lot of the legend. Well, you can't see it. The Legends paperbacks, just like in my on my Star Wars shelf. But sometimes when you look at different planets, or I'll search for all the different databases and the books for like material, and uh see if something fits, right? Because you don't want to shoehorn anything in. But sometimes if it fits, I'm like, well, why am I let's bring back this species that no one has seen in a billion years. And so yeah, so I feel like everybody tries to do that in the groups, and or they remember from a book that they read when they were younger, and they're like, yes, let's put this character back in.
I have one more small lore question. If you remember, there's a shark-like species that first kind of appeared in A Crash of Fate, and Haze is kind of the similar. Is that like a kind of a callback? The sharks.
Well, so the Protons are from uh an episode in the Clone Wars TV show, right? And so I really love that species because it reminds me of that TV show where there were like, was it called Street Sharks maybe? Do you remember? There was like a TV show where it was like sharks, and they were like like reverse mermaids, but shark heads and then human bodies. And I really love that TV show. I don't remember what it was about or what was happening in it, but I remember watching it like whatever cartoon mornings were happening. And so in one of my YA novels about mermaids, I have these like messed up sharks, and they also sort of look like that. The ones in Star Wars that look a little bit more sleeker. But I did when I was creating this species for the character Hayes, who is a baddie. She's like the baddie in the middle grade novel. Um, I was like, oh well, I kind of want to make a shark species, but I tied it to like, oh, they're a different branch from the Carcharodons, and so they have these like jaws that can unhinge, and it's modeled after an actual shark, which is the name I've already forgotten. It's in one of my thousand stacks of notes here, but it is modeled after a prehistoric shark.
I and one I guess one similarity is that they both kind of need that like climate regulation like
Yes.
water because otherwise they're gonna dry out.
Mhm.
Um I think there's actually one character in Convergence as well that kind of needs that. Might have been a Mon Calamari Marshall or something.
Mon Calo would probably, especially if they're somewhere like arid,
Arono. Yeah.
where it's just like super, the dust is so fine, the sand is so fine, they need it in there. Their face folds.
Yeah, the lack of water was definitely a thing on that planet. Like
Yeah,
it's
they
very
were.
sad almost.
I know. Yeah.
One thing I loved about the novel was the number of the point of views. Like, there's a lot of point of view characters in that novel. Was it always that way from the start?
So when I'm writing a scene, and so I try to stick to um like the main four points of views. But I do think that you reach a point in a book, and even from the very beginning, like I try to, because the book starts with a different point of view. And that's a theme in Star Wars. It's like, what part of the story are we seeing? And so as we write this content that takes a step back, that looks backward in history into the past, we're all making room for stuff like that. And so yeah, like that's my approach is when I'm writing is what part of the story am I seeing and whose eyes am I seeing it through? And I really like having that 360 third person omniscient point of view and then sinking into somebody.
Um, you said mentioned from a certain point of view, but I do believe you've also written short stories for the from a certain point of view anthologies. Does that kind of like the same concept of like seeing the same events but from a different point of view?
Yeah, I think that's what I love about the Star Wars universe is how many times we do like, we go into different TV shows and say like, oh, let's see what happened in the Clone Wars, or let's see what happened in this the Star Wars comics run where we see everything between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and what happened during those years, right? What happens in the middle of something, and so that feels like a Star Wars legacy.
So thank you so much for sitting down with us today. If people would like to keep up with you and your work, what social media platforms should they find you on?
I'm on Instagram at Zoraida Solo, so my first name, and Han Solo last name. Um, and I'm Threads, same handle, and I believe I'm on TikTok. I think it's also Zoraida Solo. I just haven't been on there for very long, so so I don't remember. But those are the where I'll be at. And also I have a Substack that you can subscribe to, which is Zoraida Writes. And yeah, find me.
Do you have any new releases that people should keep an eye out for coming up?
Well, we have the Star Wars Annual, the High Republic Annual coming out in the beginning of the year, which is so close. I can't believe it. And I think it's going to be a really great one.
All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into the WookieCast, and may the Force be with you.